Well, good morning, and I want to welcome everybody to the WIRE's 2021 summer meeting. We've got a great program lined up for our meeting today. We're in the middle of what Congressman Sean Casten has dubbed Hot FERC Summer, and in keeping with that, we've got a great speaker from FERC to talk to us about his experience and what some of his priorities are. I'm happy to go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker, is FERC Commissioner Mark Christie. Commissioner Christie took office at FERC on January 4th, 2021, and before that, he spent a considerable amount of time at the Virginia State Corporation Commission, 17 years almost, and most recently as the chairman of the Virginia State Commission before coming to FERC. He's also played other important roles in the energy industry during that time. He's the past president of OPSI, the past president of MACRUC, the Mid-Atlantic Organization for State Commissioners, and he's been active in NARUC, the National Organization for State Commissioners, during his time at the Virginia Commission. Commissioner Christie also has served as an officer in the Marine Corps. He has taught at University of Virginia. He's taught at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I found most recently, and very interesting to me, he was a law clerk in the office of the general counsel at FERC back during his time as a student at Georgetown Law School. So happy to introduce him, anxious to hear what he has to say. I will mention to our attendees that if we have time at the end of Commissioner Christie's remarks, if you have any questions, I can go ahead and I'll relay those to the commissioner. If you want to send any questions for the commissioner, you use the question function on the GoToWebinar panel, control panel on the right of your screen. Just type in the question, send it. I will get it and I can use it and relay that to the commissioner. So without any further delay, I'm happy to turn it over to Commissioner Christie. Commissioner Christie, welcome and thank you for joining us. We're anxious to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Larry, and thank you to your members, and thank you for the invitation and the honor of speaking to you. And I'm really appreciative of it. I'm going to speak to you today, not only as a FERC commissioner, but I'm also going to start by, as you mentioned, my perspective comes from the fact that I spent 17 years on the Virginia State Corporation Commission working in these very issues of transmission and infrastructure. And one of the points I want to make today is that the role state regulators play is absolutely critical if you want to get transmission built. And so I'm going to elaborate on that today. And I want to say something based on that experience of 17 years on the Virginia Commission, is that I'm a strong believer, as I think any state regulator is, but I'm a strong believer that if infrastructure is needed, then it needs to get built. And obviously that's going to cost money, and no one thinks it's not going to cost money. So if infrastructure is needed, it's going to get built. I mean, in 17 years in Virginia, I sat on literally hundreds of certificate cases, and not just for transmission, big and small projects, but also for generation and distribution. And we approved, the vast majority of those, not because we were some kind of rubber stamp, but because in every one of those proceedings, the applicant, the utility, proved that the infrastructure project was needed. And this is a key point, which I think is just glossed over far too often. Infrastructure, whether it's generation, whether it's distribution, whether it's transmission, big transmission, small transmission, regional project, local project, has to demonstrate need. And that's what state regulators do. And I'm going to talk about a couple cases today. You could even, I told Larry, you could call my speech, not speech, but talk with you, a tale of two lines, because I'm going to talk about a couple specific cases from my experience in Virginia, because I think they have lessons. But if infrastructure is needed, it needs to be built. Strong believer in that. And I got a track record doing that. We approved billions of dollars of infrastructure in Virginia for our utilities. Again, from generation to distribution to transmission, it got built, and it's serving Virginians today, and I'm proud of that. And so I think that that's the key one of the key messages is if it's needed, if an asset is needed, whatever kind of asset it is, if it's needed, it needs to be built. So how do you get it built? Is what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to use a couple of transmission line projects to draw some lessons. I want to make two overarching points today. Two overarching points. First is the best transmission policy, and I got a sneaking suspicion you all want to talk about transmission, so I'm going to talk about transmission today, focus on transmission. The best transmission policy, just like the best policy across government, but the best transmission policy is the policy that is actually achievable, that is doable. I think Bismarck said politics is the art of the possible. We need to look at what's possible, what's doable, and the best transmission policy is that which is actually doable. Okay, so it needs to be based on the reality of the circumstances. Second point I want to make today, and you're not going to be surprised to hear this, given the fact I spent 17 years as a state regulator. State regulators are not the obstacle to building needed transmission. This is a false narrative. State regulators are critically important to getting needed infrastructure built, to getting needed transmission built. And you're not going to get the needed transmission built without state regulator involvement and the credibility that they're going to bring in getting these lines built and sited in their states. And so let me illustrate these 2 points: that transmission policy needs to be realistic, and that state regulators are going to be a vital player in this process, and they should be, because they're going to have the credibility to get these projects built that are needed. So let's talk about 2 projects that I was involved in as a state regulator in Virginia, because I think they both have lessons and they illustrate the overarching points that I'm making today. Some of you may remember a project from about 12 years ago in Virginia. It was called the Trans-Allegheny Interstate Line, TRAIL. It was a large regional project. It crossed 3 states, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia. It was a 500 kV line, big line, 165 miles. PJM put it in their RTEP. Their RTEP, of course, is their regional planning, their regional plan. Other RTOs have different acronyms. If you hear me keep falling back on RTEP, it's because, I come out of 17 years in PJM and I'm sort of used to that lingo. But PJM had approved the line, put it into their RTEP as a regional project that was needed. All right, it is exactly the kind of line that we hear are needed today and are not getting built because states are the obstacle. So the TRAIL line, ultimately, we approved it in Virginia, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. Very large line, and one of the points I want to make is this was an extremely controversial line. There were 18 interveners in the case, all of which were opposed to the line. There were thousands of public comments, all of which were opposed. We held multiple public hearings all across Northern Virginia in the potential route of the line. Almost everyone that came out was opposed to the line. I can remember to this day sitting in high school gyms where people were passionately opposed to having this 500 kV line built. And one point I want to make about this TRAIL line. This TRAIL line was largely, certainly in Virginia, largely in existing right-of-way. It wasn't even an issue of using eminent domain. It wasn't even an issue of coming through greenfield, a greenfield route. It was mostly in existing right-of-way. And nevertheless, it was just bitterly, bitterly opposed. So at the end of the day, though, we issued the CPCN. Here's an important thing I want to say to you about CPCN. Remember what CPCN stands for. It is a Certificate of Public Need. The N stands for need. And in every one of these transmission line cases, need is probably the single biggest question that the regulator has to deal with. Is it needed? Again, that's what the N in CPCN stands for. So in the TRAIL line, it was very controversial, very bitterly opposed. But at the end of the day, all 3 states, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia, all 3 state commissions, despite the opposition, said, this line is needed, we find that it is needed, and we approved it, and it got built. And to this day, the TRAIL line is to this very day the largest single regional project ever built in PJM. And I voted for it. I don't regret it. I'm glad we voted for it. I'm glad Virginia approved it. I'm glad the other states approved it. Why? Because it was needed. We made a finding on an extensive factual record of hundreds of pages that it was needed. Now, we didn't find it was needed simply because PJM put it into the RTAP. I mean, that was evidence. And PJM sent Steve Hurling down, a guy I have tremendous respect for. He was a very credible witness. Steve Hurling came down, testified, and I always regarded Steve he had huge credibility, and that's an important thing to remember when you weigh evidence. But the fact that it got put into the PJM RTAP was not itself proof that it was needed. It was evidence that it was needed, but we in Virginia, the Virginia Commission, we had to do our own due diligence. And that's where we got off going to scores of public hearings, taking hundreds of pages of public comment, and looking at evidence over hundreds of pages of a record. And only after doing that, and of course weighing the evidence that PJM had presented, Steve Hurling and other witnesses, as why it was needed. And the evidence was it was going to solve numerous NERC violations. It was needed for reliability. And we ultimately made the decision, yes, it is. We approved it, it got built, okay? So one of the lessons from the trail line, which again, to this day, is the largest single regional line ever built in PJM, which I voted for, and we approved in all 3 states, is that need, if it's proven, the line is going to get built, but it has to be proven. And you can't just say, as some people are saying today, well, gee, if the RTO puts it in their RTAP or their MTAP or whatever their acronym is, well, that proves it right there. It's needed. No, it doesn't. The process of putting it into a regional plan does not prove need. That starts the process. You need this, and the state regulators come in because they have to approve it under their own state law and do what we did in Virginia on trail, and ultimately we approved it. Now we turn to a second line. And oh, by the way, the trail line, because it had state approvals, it was appealed to our state Supreme Court. I'm sure it was appealed in the other states as well, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. I know it was appealed to federal court. The appeals held up because the process was strictly followed, and that line got built. So if you want to listen to how you get a regional line built, I think the trail case really shows you how it can work and how it should work. And by the way, if you want a copy of that opinion, you might want to read it. It's a very interesting opinion. It came out in 2008. October 2008. You can call our public information office in Virginia Commission and they'll give you a copy. But I think it's a good case study of how you get a very controversial regional project, the kind of projects we're told today the states are holding up, how you get it built. Now let me go to another case from Virginia that I'm also aware of, and I think it has lessons as well. And I'm going to guess that most people on the line today are too young to remember something called Project Mountaineer. If you remember it, you're dating yourself. The Project Mountaineer was a big, much ballyhooed project that came out. You got to go all the way back to the second term of the Bush administration in the 2000. I think it was also in 2008, same time we were doing trail. Project Mountaineer was going to be 4 765 kV lines running from West Virginia to East Coast load centers from Virginia all the way up to New Jersey. 4 corridors of 765 kV lines. And it got a lot of publicity. FERC had to get a big presentation from PJM on Project Mountaineer. The politicians got involved, a lot of political support. Other RTOs had their own major projects that they're going to run hundreds of miles. I think MISO had one. There's some others. And here's one of the ironies about Project Mountaineer as it was proposed and got a lot of publicity and attention at FERC. The rationale for Project Mountaineer, these 4 765 kV lines, was it was going to bring cheap, abundant, available power from southwestern West Virginia to these East Coast load centers hundreds of miles away. Now where heard that rationale recently? The rationale today is we need these hundreds of mile long 500 to 765 kV lines to bring power from where it can be most feasibly generated over hundreds of miles to the load centers, because it's not near the load centers. Same rationale for Project Mountaineer. Difference, of course, one of the differences, Project Mountaineer was going to bring power from coal generators in West Virginia. Now the power is going to come from wind and solar, hundreds of miles away. So, but the rationale is the same, that we need these 100-mile long big transmission lines to bring power from remote locations to the load centers. That was the rationale for Project Mountaineer. Project Mountaineer never got built. And it didn't get built for a lot of reasons. It was, first of all, unfeasible when you started looking at the cost. None of the states in the path who were going to be the flyover states wanted it. And so basically Project Mountaineer just never got off the ground. There was one small project, though, that was part of Project Mountaineer that I'm very familiar with. And some of you may remember this if you're of a certain age. It was called the Potomac Appalachian Transmission Highline, PATH, the PATH line. And the PATH line actually did get proposed and submitted to state commissions, including mine. The PATH line was going to run from West Virginia through Virginia to Maryland. It was mostly going to be greenfield development. So the PATH line was actually one segment of the original Project Mountaineer, which was 4 765 kV corridors. So the PATH line did get proposed, and it actually got submitted to all 3 commissions in West Virginia, Virginia, and Maryland. It was extremely controversial, just as Trail was. But unlike Trail, it never got approved, never got built. What happened with PATH, in addition, of course, to which was, and the fact that it was mostly greenfield made it even more controversial even than Trail, if you can believe that. And I said on Trail, and I know how controversial that was. So that was going to be a greenfield line. None of the states approved it. And here's what happened. The states never actually had to vote on it. We in Virginia never, ever voted on it. And the reason we didn't vote on PATH is because PJM, which had originally put it in the RTEP as a needed project, ultimately changed the load forecast and took it out. Now that's not a knock on PJM. PJM has an ongoing obligation to adjust their load forecast as the facts change. But here was a large project that was put in the RTEP as a needed project and was ultimately removed before the states even voted on it. I think another element to the withdrawal of that was we in Virginia had ordered studies on a potential alternative that another TO had offered, and it may have obviated the need for PATH. So the lesson here is not that PJM screwed up. They didn't screw up. They did what they were supposed to do. They put a line into the RTEP that they thought was needed based on the facts that they had at the time. As they ultimately changed their load forecast based on changing facts, they revised their RTEP and they took PATH out of the RTEP. And so again, we at the state level never even actually voted on it. So the process worked. The process worked. But imagine this. Imagine a couple counter scenarios. Let's say that in Trail, let's go back to Trail, which we in Virginia approved along with the other 2 states, and it got built. Let's say that actually in Virginia we had not approved it, or one of the other 2 states, Pennsylvania or West Virginia, had not approved it. Suppose that then the federal government had designated Trail, the old acronym was NITSE, or maybe it's still in the code, National Interest Electric Transmission Corridor. But let's say that Virginia had turned down Trail, or Pennsylvania turned down Trail, and after the extensive record that we built, and then the federal government came in and said, well, we're going to order it built anyway, because you guys can't get off the dime, to use a quote I heard the other day. You guys can't get off the dime, and so the federal government is now going to order Trail to be built. Would it really have gotten built? None of the opposition would have gone away. you would have had a situation where the state regulator had done a month-long analysis, taken hundreds of pages of testimony. We had held scores of hearings where people could come and express their opposition. And at the end of all that, what if we had found it was not needed, but then the federal government comes in and says, well, we know better than these state regulators who actually gave, people their public hearings and listened to hundreds of people. And we're going to come in and we're going to order it built anyway. Is that realistic to think that that would have actually been built? Is it realistic to think that there would have been the credibility when a state regulator had done the extensive review that we did in Virginia on Trail? If we had come out and said, no, we don't think it's needed. But what about PATH? We never actually voted on PATH because PJM took it out of the RTEP before we could even vote on it, before we even had to vote on it, which illustrates, again, the critically important point I want to make. There's this impression that you hear in the rhetoric that, states are standing in the way of these vitally needed projects. Well, that presumes need, right? But it's the states that determine the need through their CPCN process. It's the states who are going to review all the projects and do what we did in Trail and compile an extensive record which can stand up on appeal, and it did stand up on appeal. And Trail got built. And again, biggest regional project in PJM to this very day. And it got built because we approved it, not because PJM put it in the RTEP, but because we did the due diligence along with West Virginia and along with Pennsylvania. PATH never got built just because PJM put it in the RTEP. Didn't prove that it was needed. It was evidence. But PJM comes in later and says, no, it's not needed anymore. What if we'd approved and built PATH? So then you'd have consumers paying for a line that was not even needed because the load forecast changed. So the point I want to make on both of these projects, Trail and PATH, one that got built, multi-state project, one that never got built because the case for need was never there. It was never there. And that's the vital role that state regulators play. And so the idea that state regulators are the obstacle to building needed projects is a false narrative because, first of all, it presumes a single project is needed, and you don't know that until you've had an actual case and compiled a record. So you can't just presume that a project is needed. They presume PATH was needed because PJM put it in the regional plan. But the facts didn't show it, and PJM ultimately took it out. So the point being is, state regulators are not the obstacle. State regulators are a vital part of getting these projects built. Trail got built because the 3 state commissions did their due diligence and had the credibility because they did their due diligence and got those projects built. Now let me mention something else. I'll mention a couple other projects. Oftentimes, the holdup is not state regulators. It's federal agencies doing various environmental reviews. And I'm not opposed to those reviews, and many of them are required by NEPA or other statutes. But I'll give you 2 examples that illustrate that. Another regional project that was in the PJM RTEP that we ultimately approved in Virginia was called Skiffs Creek. It was a 500 kV line that crossed the James River near Williamsburg, a little bit more recent line. Very controversial. Again, all these regional projects, these big projects, are going to be intensely controversial. You can bank on it, okay? You don't build a 500 kV line in the dark at night and think no one's going to notice, or a 765 kV. People are going to notice, okay? You're not going to get these things built with nobody noticing. So Skiffs Creek was a 500 kV line. It crossed the James River. It was extremely controversial because it crossed the James River at a very historically sensitive part, right there at Williamsburg. Again, hundreds of people opposed it. Extensive record. We compiled a record of almost of thousands of pages. We looked at all the alternatives. And at the end of the day, we issued the CPCN. We found it was needed, not because PJM put it into the RTEP, which they did, but because the evidence in the case proved it. Now, PJM's analysis was certainly evidence. And again, their witnesses came down and testified with great credibility. But we made our own decision that Skiffs Creek was needed, and we approved it, and it ultimately got built. But you know what? A certain federal agency took months and months and months after we'd approved it to do its own reviews and to ultimately issue its own approvals. So we were not the cause of the holdup in Virginia. It was the federal agency. And again, I'm not saying those reviews were not needed. They're needed under federal law. It was the Army Corps. But it took them a lot longer than it took us. And I'll tell you another example. Maybe some of you remember this. You're really going back if you remember this. Some of you from Appalachian might remember it. Appalachian Power, which is an AEP unit, had a project which goes all the way back to the 90s, and it was going to run from Wyoming County, West Virginia, into Southwest Virginia near Wytheville, and it was called the Wyoming-Jackson Ferry Line. It was a 90-mile line, 765 kV, big transmission line. Ultimately, make a long story short, the two state commissions, West Virginia and Virginia, both approved it. We both approved it. It was held up for another 2 years, waiting on federal approvals. It had to be approved by numerous federal agencies, the Park Service, because it went through parkland, the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Forest Service. Ultimately, it needed a special use permit for about 11 miles. I think it was from the Park Service. It took 18 to 24 months, as I recall, to get all the federal approvals. So it wasn't Virginia or West Virginia state commissions that held it up. It was federal agencies doing environmental reviews or the other reviews they had to do under endangered species. And again, I'm not saying I'm against those. The point I want to make is holding up as some of the politicians do and say, well, it's these state regulators who won't get off the dime and they're holding up all these vitally needed projects. It's oftentimes not the state regulators that are the cause of the delay or even the ultimately stopping them entirely. It's federal agencies doing their needed, by law, environmental or other reviews. So if you really want to see transmission get built faster, then I would suggest to you that you need to talk to some of the members of Congress about the amount and the duration of the various reviews that have to take place under federal law. Because I've given you two examples, Skiffs Creek and Wyoming-Jackson Ferry, of two actual lines in the real world. They were not held up by Virginia or West Virginia. In Skiffs Creek, it was just Virginia. We approved them. They were held up by federal reviews. So if you want to speed things up, I would suggest that's one place you might want to look. But my overall point, again, it's really, I guess, threefold. Assets that need to be built, whether they're transmission, whether they're generation, whether they're distribution, if they need to be built, they need to be built, then they should be built. And we know there's a cost to that. It ought to be built at least cost to the consumer as well. But who is best suited to determine whether they're needed? That's what's missing from a lot of this rhetoric. The question of determining whether they're needed is not simply about putting them into an RTO plan. That's essentially a bureaucratic exercise, and I don't say that pejoratively. I'm just saying the nature of the process. There's not going to be cross-examination. There's not going to be review of evidence. There's not going to be different witnesses in that process. The review of need is going to take place at the state level, and it should take place at the state level. That's one of my big points. It should take place at the state level. State regulators should be the one determining need ultimately. And if you really want to see these big projects built, you're going to need the state regulators to be reviewing these projects and coming to a well-reasoned, with a good record, a conclusion that the project is needed. That's going to be key to getting a project like Trail, biggest project ever built in PJM, to getting it built, because the state regulators come to that conclusion. And the people in that state, even if they don't like the result, at least they know it was local officials, state officials, who heard them, who listened to them, who gave them the opportunity to come out to high school gyms at night and express their opposition, and ultimately came to a decision which they stood behind. And that's going to be critical. And I would submit to you that if you cut state regulators out of the process, or if you think that you can have some law that says, well, you know, if a line gets put into a regional plan and a state won't approve it, then we're going to let Department of Energy or FERC or some national super transmission czar force it. I think that's unrealistic. And it gets back to my point about the best policy is the policy that is realistic. I don't think it's realistic to think some national transmission czar is going to override a decision made by state officials and have any credibility in that state. Any credibility. And I think you're going to have a firestorm of criticism and a firestorm of opposition if you start trying to do that. I really do. So if you want to get transmission built, I think state regulators have got to be a critically important part of the process and not be, you know, having a sword of Damocles over their head because, well, if you don't approve it, we're just going to come in with USDOE and approve it anyway. I don't think that's the way to get it built. But if it's needed, we need to build it. I want to be absolutely clear on that. I'm not against transmission. My gosh, I spent 17 years approving billions of dollars of infrastructure in Virginia. Billions of dollars of infrastructure across all three classes of assets: transmission, distribution, generation. If it's needed, it needs to be built. So that's my point, or 2 points. So Larry, thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'll be glad to entertain them.
Great. Thank you very much, Commissioner Christie. Really appreciate hearing your perspective on the challenges around getting transmission built. And I do have a few questions to follow up with you on. And I'm getting some questions in from some of our participants as well. And one of them, the first one I want to start with, I think feeds right into the theme you were expressing through your opening remarks, which is, you're well aware, FERC has initiated a joint task force process, federal and state task force. The NARUC has now designated the state commissioner representatives that they want to have on that task force. You know, I'm curious as to what you think what you're looking to see come out of that process of working between the federal government and the states, and then particularly how it plays into some of these issues you've been raising about the role of the states, state commissions in getting transmission built. So I'm curious again to hear what you're thinking in terms of how the process will play out, what you'd like to see come out of it, and what do you think the states are looking to see come out of that process?
Well, I think the states, you know, are always eager to be in dialogue with FERC, and I think this is a good opportunity for dialogue. I think NARUC, when they adopted this, agreed to this forum, made it clear that the state regulators on this joint task force, you know, were not empowered to speak for any individual state or certainly override state laws. State laws are state laws. But it's a good forum. I look at it as a good opportunity to have a dialogue. You know, it's like Churchill said, talk's better than fight. So I think it's mainly a forum for exchange of ideas and just, you know, for states to have an opportunity to express their concerns and their sensitivities to FERC commissioners, and I certainly look forward to participating in it.
I think we're all looking forward to see how that process plays out and what comes out of it. But another question that I've gotten from one of our participants I wanted to ask you about focuses on this, the question of need that you talked about.
Right.
And a lot of our members are coming at it from the transmission developer perspective. And one of them says, how can we address need issues across multiple states in a situation where you have a public policy project and it's not a reliability project?
Mm-hmm.
And if that public policy is, you know, an RPS standard or mandate for one state, but then does provide benefits to other states, and it requires some level of cost sharing. So they're concerned about how do you make that need demonstration in a situation like that? We don't have a reliability issue, but it's really more a public policy question.
Well, there are really two issues there. One is need, and one is cost allocation. And cost allocation, as we all know, is a very popular issue that everybody wants to jump into all the time because it's so much fun. But PJM handles those projects through its state agreement approach. And the state agreement approach says quite clearly that, if a project is not a reliability project, or it's a project to relieve congestion, if it's driven purely by an individual state's public policy, then PJM will work with the state on various technical aspects of it, but the state has to bear the cost because it's driven by that state's public policies. And you can't shift the cost of that state's public policies. The political choices made by that state are the political choices made by a state, and you can't shift those onto consumers in other states who had no part in selecting the politicians who made those choices. So the PJM process, and I can remember very well, going back, long time, because I've been around a long time. I remember having long conversations, actually they weren't very long, it's more of being taught, with Steve Hurling at PJM and Mike Cormos at PJM, two guys I just have tremendous respect for. They were straight shooters, and I learned a lot from them. And saying, the way a project gets in the RTEP, because when you get in the RTEP, you're eligible for regional cost allocation. So the question about how you get into a regional, get eligible for regional cost allocation, you have to be looking at criteria that make sure that people who aren't benefiting are not being charged. Because you can't charge people when they're not getting benefits. And to say that someone in one state, well, you're going to get some benefits from what another state wants to do, so you ought to have to pay for it. Well, again, you got to look at the facts, and you got to look at the facts of the individual project. And one of the questions about a public policy driven project, was that the optimal project? If there is a reliability violation, if there are NERC violations, if there is a specific need that the planners have identified, like Trail, which was a multi-state project, was a reliability project. There were demonstrated NERC violations that supported the need for Trail, and we were convinced by that. And so we approved it, and we knew it was going to be regionally cost allocated, and we're fine with regional cost allocation for projects in other states under the cost allocation formula that PJM uses. But it's one thing to say we're willing to pay for projects that are needed for reliability versus saying consumers in one state ought to have to pay for the political choices made in another state.
Well, and then just sort of a bit of a follow on to that, somewhat related question is, something that we grapple with frequently is how do transmission developers deal with a situation where it's a project crossing multiple states. One of the, as they put phrase, flyover states says no, we're not going to go ahead and approve this project, effectively killing it. What do transmission developers do in that situation where it's crossing multiple states? You have a demonstration of need, but you got one of the flyover states basically vetoing the project.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, this illustrates I think the unreality of thinking that you're going to have these 600, 700 mile long lines, from one state, with 3 or 4 flyover states, ending at a load center somewhere else. I just think the reality of that is exactly what you just illustrated. There have been proposals like that. And if you're in the flyover state and you're looking at 765 coming through a 1,000-foot corridor, and for Wyoming Jackson's Ferry, it was about a 1,000-foot corridor. And if it's a greenfield, if you're talking about a greenfield development, you're talking about a 1,000-foot wide greenfield project with massive use of eminent domain. How realistic is that to think that a state that is simply the flyover state is going to approve that? I mean, I agree that it's difficult to cite them. So what is the lesson is? The lesson is the RTOs, I think, potentially there needs to be a big push to look and see whether the reliability need or the congestion need can be satisfied with less costly alternatives. One of the reasons PATH went down is not just because PJM changed the load forecast. I mean, they did, and that obviated the need. But we in Virginia had a proposal from another utility that proposed that they had a smaller, cheaper alternative in an existing right-of-way, a rebuild of an existing line, and it would be much cheaper, much less intrusive because it was an existing right of way, and it would solve the identified reliability needs. And as it turned out, so we ordered that alternative to be reviewed. So the point being, at the end of the day, a state's got to make a decision. If you want to run a 765 kV line a couple hundred miles across the state, from a point alpha to point omega, and that was the controversy in Virginia on path. We were the flyover state. Okay, it was going to run from West Virginia to Maryland, and Virginia was the flyover state. And so those are tough to cite. Those are tough to sell to the people in the path. And this goes back to my point. The idea that a federal regulator is going to, first of all, know more about local conditions. One thing I learned as a Virginia regulator for 17 years, I knew that I didn't know as much about any one of the other 49 states. Kentucky, Indiana, Minnesota, California, Idaho, Texas, you name it. I learned that as a Virginia regulator, I didn't know as much about any other state as the regulators in that state, about their local conditions and their local circumstances. And you know what? Now that I'm at FERC, I don't know any more about those other 49 states than those local regulators do either, because we can't. No one can know more. You can't sit in Washington and know more about the local needs and the local circumstances in Kentucky or Missouri or Nebraska than the regulators and the people on the ground in those states. And that's a very important point to always remember as we look at what's going to actually get transmission built.
Well, one of the thoughts that crossed my mind as you're discussing these is it sure seems like a lot of these issues you're flagging are more or less teed up or potentially coming to a head in the ANOPR, the Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that just put out last week, the other week. And just wanted to ask you a little bit about what your thoughts are on, where that ANOPR is heading. I know in your concurrence, you talked about, it looks like there are some questions and proposals that may be showing some promise. But you also said on the other end, there are some, I think you described them as not ready for prime time in your concurrence. And I guess I was curious, can you give a little bit more? You didn't really get into anything specific on that other than just sort of saying there's some in this category, some in the others. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what your thinking is in terms of, particularly on the ones you think are not so much ready for prime time that may be in that ANOPR?
Well, there's got to be some suspense or no one would tune in. But there are so many issues teed up in that ANOPR. I didn't count them up, but there are many, many, many issues teed up. And what I did say, it's been 10 years since FERC Order 1000. And by the way, we approved Trail before FERC Order 1000. So Trail was not because of FERC Order 1000. It was 2008. It was before it. So there's been some successes with FERC Order 1000. There's also been some problems, and I did identify. We all know there's a lot of problems in the RTO interconnection queues, and there's some. I think there's some good ideas in the ANOPR. I'm not going to identify them because it make it too easy for you, but I think there's some good ideas in trying to bring some rationality, and I think that's what's needed is some rationality to the interconnection queues so that the projects that are ready to go, remember 10 years ago, the big cliche was shovel ready, right? Well, it's usually used and doesn't really mean it, but there are generating projects that I think are much more ready than another one at a given stage. And so the ANOPR tees up some ideas for bringing some rationality to the to that process, and I look forward to that. And I said there's some ideas that are not ready for prime time. Maybe they will be if they're fleshed out with some detail. Maybe they never will be. But I'll obviously have more to say as it develops. The ANOPR, is really it tees up a number of issues. And allows groups like yours and of course a whole panoply of groups I'm sure we're going to hear from, and I hope so, we should. There's a whole panoply of groups that get to speak out and submit, and so I genuinely want to see what people have to say. I read this stuff. And I hope we're going to have a technical conference related to this. I love the ability to question people in a live technical conference and get that dialogue, that conversation back and forth. So there's a lot of issues teed up. I think some of them have potential to be really good ideas. Some could be with some detail. Some I don't think ever will be, but we'll just have to see, where the process goes. But it's going to be a long process, but it should be. I mean, my goodness, we're talking about a very sweeping, comprehensive look at the federal role in transmission planning. I mean, on a very holistic basis. So it should be a long process with thousands of pages of comment, because it's coin a phrase, it's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, the scope of what the commission put out there is potentially enormous. It's almost perfect, I would say. And I know that's another piece you emphasized in your concurrence was that this is the very beginning of a long process. You mentioned here the potential for technical conferences based on what may come in. How long do you see this process playing out? Do you see something coming out from the commission by the end of next year?
Well, I'm not the chairman. You'd have to ask him. He has said publicly, so I'm not, revealing anything. I would never quote another commissioner privately. He has said, from what I've read, that he'd like to have this done by the end of next year. So he's the chairman, and that looks like that's what it'll be.
One other area I wanted to talk about or ask you about, which is something that you flagged in your testimony, your written testimony you provided for the House Energy and Commerce Oversight Committee from earlier this week. You said one of your top priorities is reliability.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that in terms of what do you see as the most pressing challenges with respect to reliability, and what are the solutions to those challenges?
Well, very good question, and it lends itself to a multifaceted answer. And I'm not trying to be a lawyer here and charge by the word, but used to do that. But this is there are a lot of aspects to it. So let's look at the federal aspect. So what is FERC's role in reliability? Well, first of all, of course, we're the overseer of, or have oversight over NERC, which is the mandatory reliability standards. So that's one element of it. A big element, of course, is that we regulate the regional planning, the transmission planning, whether it's RTO or non-RTO. We have regulatory authority over that transmission planning. So we need to be looking at the planning and how it's promoting reliability. Look, transmission is a key part of reliability. I mean, absolutely. That's why we call them reliability projects, right? I mean, it's not just a nice label. I mean, they're called a reliability project because they're needed for reliability. So, we need to have a planning process that gets reliability projects built. That's essential. We need to get reliability projects built. Another aspect of reliability at the federal level, of course, is we regulate the RTO markets. And that gets into resource adequacy. And I made a point, I think I made it at the House committee a couple of days ago, maybe I didn't, but I made it before. It's important to understand what FERC can do and what FERC cannot do. FERC cannot order any individual state or utility to build a generating resource. We can't order California to build more of combined cycle gas, which they don't want to do. We can't order Texas to build more nuclear combined cycle. We can't do that. FERC can't order states to build generating resources, and FERC cannot order states to shut resources down or to not shut them down. I was asked at my Senate confirmation if I supported state RPSs, and I said every state's got the absolute authority, its sovereign authority is to determine its own generation mix. That's up to the state. I strongly support that. So we can't tell the state, you don't have enough generating resources domestic, you're depending too much on imports. We can't tell them to build more domestic generating resources. That's their decision. What we can do is for the states that are in RTOs, obviously we review the transmission planning processes and we look at the capacity markets. And if you're talking the Eastern RTOs, of course, PJM, New York, and New England, they use capacity markets in a way that the others don't. And those capacity markets are basically mandatory, and they're the way they achieve resource adequacy. So our job in looking at those capacity markets is to be is to use our authority to make sure that they're delivering reliability. Because if they're going to use capacity markets as the primary source of resource adequacy, then you got to get it right. You got to get it right. Now, other RTOs use capacity markets either as a residual, or some of them don't even have them. We certainly don't mandate it, because in many of those states, and those like in MISO and SPP, and most states, it's the states themselves who are responsible for resource adequacy, and so it's up to the state commissions to make sure their utilities have adequate resources, which is the way it ought to be, by the way. Again, I look at it from a state's perspective, and we spend a lot of time in Virginia reviewing IRPs, integrated resource plans, where you look at the whole mix and make sure your utilities have adequate resources to serve reliability. And I think the IRP process is actually very good.
Well, we're getting a little bit close towards the end of the time here. I'd have one or two more questions I just wanted to run by you. One is just, again, looking back on your experience as a state commissioner, now you're at the federal level. What do you see as the big differences between your past role versus your current role at FERC?
I was having that conversation a couple of days ago with well, I won't name him, but a reporter, and I said the biggest difference to me, coming from Virginia to FERC, is in Virginia, whenever we had a major case, we would go in the courtroom, and we might go in the courtroom for days on end, and we would hear from many, many, many witnesses. And the best way to test the credibility of a witness is to be in the courtroom and watch them on the stand, and as they're subject to direct examination by their own attorney and cross-examination by other attorneys, and you really come to a conclusion about who do you believe, because that's what juries do. And in a lot of ways, judges are jurors in black robes, although we didn't wear black robes in Virginia. So, but the point is, you make a credibility decision. But I really enjoyed the many, many, many hours in Virginia we spent in the courtroom. We would go into a courtroom and spend days on a case and really explore all the factual elements that were relevant. And at FERC, as commissioners, we mostly make all our decisions based on paper filings and based on pleadings that come to us. You know that, Larry. And FERC commissioners, rarely, if ever, I haven't seen a situation yet, but we don't go in a courtroom and actually conduct a fact finding and we have ALJs that do that, but we don't do it as FERC commissioners. We sort of take the record as it comes, and we have to act on the paper. And just from a purely standpoint of what I really liked in Virginia, all the time I spent in the courtroom and watching the interplay with the lawyers. We had a lot of really good lawyers come in front of us, and just watching them at work on the cross-examination and being able to question witnesses. I was a very active questioner, as lawyers will tell you, and as witnesses will tell you, very active questioner of witnesses and lawyers. And I learned a lot from that. And of course, here at FERC, we don't get to do that. We just take the paper as it comes, and we have to act on the paper.
Well, one of the observations some have made over the last few years is a sense that there's, at least at FERC, an increase in the partisanship on some issues from the commission's perspective. I'm just curious as to whether you've seen that in your time at FERC, and to the extent that you are seeing it, how different is that from what your experience was at the Virginia Commission?
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't comment on it, because that would be getting into deliberative process, because you'd have to say, well, this is what happened at FERC. So I really am not going to comment on it, because I think it would probably, by definition, involve, internal discussions. Maybe that's a little too sensitive, but I can always, cop out on that, because I haven't been there that long. I will say this about Virginia. The culture in Virginia is that the Virginia State Corporation Commission is not a bipartisan commission. It is a nonpartisan commission, and that is a very big difference. When you go on the Virginia Commission, whatever partisan background you had, you check it at the door. And the legislature has historically looked at the SCC as a nonpartisan commission. It has historically reelected people regardless of how the legislature changes in its composition. I got reelected 3 times. And so consequently, the Virginia Commission, it's also independent. It's a constitutional commission. And so consequently, you really have, and I mean, it's for an absolute fact, after 17 years, there is zero partisan influence on the Virginia Commission, zero, regardless of what the people's backgrounds. I mean, everybody who goes on there, and I served with people, when I got there, the two members with me were former members of the legislature, and one was a Democrat, one was a Republican, and you would never know it. So that was a great culture, and I really respected that. So, you know, FERC, of course, is bipartisan, and, you know, it sort of amuses me. I see a lot of these trade press, and they say, well, you know, the Democratic member so-and-so or the Republican member so-and-so, which I know that's the way it works at FERC, but, you know, 17 years in Virginia, no one ever said, you know, identified you by party, because the SEC was a truly nonpartisan institution. I really like that.
Well, Commissioner, thank you very much for your time. You've been very generous with your time with us today. Been very interested to hear what you have to say, and we appreciate your sharing your thoughts. So I want to thank you very much. And with that, I think we're going to close out the keynote speaker portion of our program, and we will move on to the next portion of our program. So I'm going to ask if our